Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. This talk today, I'm going to be talking really about the risks we currently face for having imported infections into the UK, although I'm going to broaden it out beyond that. Now, the tendency to assume that you can stop infections at borders is an extremely long-standing one. It's almost always wrong. And we've quoted here from Shakespeare, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war. Well, against the hand of war, I think there is a little bit of historical basis for. Shakespeare was perfectly well aware, although he was, I suspect, pandering to the prejudices of his audience, that this was not true. Two diseases in particular crop up repeatedly in his writings. Plague and syphilis, and both of those he knew perfectly well were imported multiple times into the United Kingdom. I'm just illustrating initially plague, because plague is really the example of an extraordinary infectious disease that actually invades other countries. And this is the time it took plague to move in the pre-industrial times, very slow movement. It entered along the Silk Route in 1347, and it had actually got all the way through Europe, right up into the northern areas by 1351. That's in pre-industrial times, with a relatively slow-moving bacteria in terms of its movement. Plague was, of course, an extraordinary impact on the countries that it affected. It is estimated to have reduced the world's population, just as a single disease, from 450 million to around about 350 million. And when you think about that in modern terms, the impact is quite extraordinary. And some estimates suggest that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. The risk of a plague epidemic is now considered by the WHO to be near zero, and I'll be discussing why that is the case, along with a number of other diseases. But I think to understand that infectious diseases can be dramatic in their impact, I think you don't need to look much further. An example, another example is syphilis. Where there is trade, where there is travel, and where there is war, disease will always follow. And syphilis, another thing which Shakespeare wrote about very extensively, arrived in Europe around about 1493, and it spread probably due to mercenary soldiers who were in the siege of Naples, and it spread very rapidly. So it was in Edinburgh by 1497. Again, this is in pre-industrial periods. So the ability of diseases to move rapidly in pre-industrial periods is quite impressive. Foreigners are often blamed for diseases, not always fairly. Just taking syphilis itself, I've given three of the names we chose to give it in the UK: the French pox, the Spanish pox, and the Neapolitan disease, depending on who was most out of favour at that particular point in time. I'm sure all of you have at various points talked about German measles, Spanish flu, and Mexican swine flu, or Mexican pig flu. So the idea, we all believe that foreigners is what did it, even if we don't read the kind of newspapers which say that as a routine part of their Saturday morning fare. Probably the most dramatic of the recent pandemics that we've had is influenza, and the really big one within recent history is the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1922. Influenza in the 20th century killed more people than all the wars combined, and a very large number of those deaths were concentrated in this single pandemic over 2 or 3 years. And looking at the speed of spread of influenza, this is obviously in the modern era with a disease that spreads relatively rapidly. This is the USA. It entered the USA around about September the 14th. The very light colours is where it had got to by October the 5th. So over less than a month, it had spread through the entire country and had a very, very major impact in mortality. And then if we look at something like HIV, a disease which is much more difficult to spread, you obviously have to try to catch HIV, which you don't have to try to catch influenza. If you looked at HIV in Africa between the mid-1980s and 1999, you have a situation where it goes from an extremely rare disease in a few places to one where many countries in that continent had a prevalence. When I was working in Malawi around 1999, 40% of people, of women of my age, at that stage, had the virus. All of them went on to die. The majority of the people I trained in medicine died in the 3 or 4 years after I did so. So this was a disease of extraordinary impact, and it was a new disease. It's one that had jumped the species barrier, which I'll come on to. So the ability of diseases to spread is very impressive, and even in the last 100 years, we've had diseases which have been new to the world and which have been a very major toll on humanity. And of course, the complexity of networks and speed of travel, and also the world's population, is increasing the whole time. This is a map of the various ways in which the population travels around the world. You'll notice that we are right in the middle. Anybody who thinks about this knows that if you're an American, for example, who lives in California and you go down to South Africa, it's via London you're going to go. We are absolutely plumb in the middle of this transport network by land, sea, and air. So when you put these together, potentially you could say we're looking at an extremely concerning and frightening situation. But for reasons I'm going to come on to, I do not consider that we should exaggerate the risks in this century, whilst, of course, not wishing to trivialize them. The first thing to understand is that infectious diseases often cause a panic disproportionate to the real risk. And I'm illustrating this in this case by the anthrax attacks that occurred in 2001 on the US Capitol, which is closed down for rather different reasons at the moment. But a disease which actually infected 17 people and killed 5 managed to paralyze the entire American government. This is at a time when 650 people a week die on the roads in the USA. So very clearly, because it was infectious, and the point about anthrax is you can't pass it from person to person. It's not transmissible like the plague and things we were talking about earlier on. You either get it from your direct contact or not. It was clearly given an importance which really, statistically, it should not have. Or it may be that it is it is rational, but it's rational because you're uncertain. When a disease is new, clearly you do not quite know what you're going to face. And people have to overreact initially until it's clear what the risk is. 2 recent examples, which all of you remember, are SARS, which came out of China, and BSE, new variant CJD, one of the UK's own contributions to new diseases recently. Not everything comes from foreigners. The SARS epidemic occurred between November 2002 and July 2003, and it caused a total of under 10,000 cases and under 1,000 deaths in 37 countries. So it spread extremely rapidly and then died out for a variety of reasons which are only partially understood. This disease, with this very small number of deaths in global terms, and I'm comparing it to the roughly 100,000 smoking-related deaths there are every year in the United Kingdom, so let's just give it a bit of perspective, cost the global economy around $40 billion, and particularly hit the economies of Southeast Asia, travel industry, and Canada. So new diseases can have an impact on the economy way out of proportion to their impact actually on human health compared to things we do know about. And uncertainty certainly compounds this. There are, of course, a very large number of diseases that if you go off to exciting and beautiful parts of the world, you can catch and import into the UK. And in fact, my trade, when I'm working as a physician in the hospital tropical diseases, depends on you catching those diseases and hopefully me helping, and my colleagues helping to do something about them. The point about a very large portion of these diseases, however, is that from a biological point of view, from the time you touch down in London and Manchester, you are a biological dead-end host. These diseases cannot be transmitted on because something is missing. So, for example, malaria, the top I've suggested, malaria and dengue, two mosquito-borne diseases. Now, we used to have malaria in the UK, but the numbers are right down, and the risk of malaria being transmitted in the UK is now as close to zero as makes no difference. You can transmit it a bit in southern Europe. Dengue, we just don't currently have the mosquitoes, although they are moving their range, arguably, possibly, due to climate change. But if you don't have the vectors, these diseases are going to stop transmission. There's no chance you're going to transmit to anybody else, however hard you try, with the possible exception of doing needle-to-needle. If you choose to share needles whilst you're injecting your groin because you're a drug user, possibly you could pass it on, but you'd have to try pretty hard. On the bottom, I put down 2 diseases passed on by flies. This one, eyeworm, looks a lot more dramatic than it is, lower. But obviously people who haven't a worm in their eye get quite excited about it. This is a rather more serious disease, actually, sleeping sickness, trypanosomiasis, passed on by a different fly. Neither of these flies, Christop's fly and tsetse fly, come anywhere near the UK or would survive here. So these diseases will not be transmitted in the UK because they don't have the vectors. Another thing that people do when they're overseas, sometimes they're eaten by insects and sometimes they eat other things. And some of the things that people choose to eat when they're overseas are delicious and not very good for them. These are just a few examples. This rather nice crab, there's a dish called drunken crab, which you don't cook it, you just put it in alcohol. That does make it taste good, but it doesn't kill things, so you can get a parasite in your lung. This one here, giant land snails, eating them semi-cooked, I'm told is delicious. I certainly have not tried it because it causes a parasitic meningitis you do not want to get. This one here can cause a very painful. This one here can carry worms and cause a very painful abdominal thing. And here, the humble beef and pork tapeworm. This is an ordinary tapeworm you can just get from undercooked ordinary meal. The point I'm making about this is if you eat exotic foods and you don't cook them, you may well catch something. But that is not going to be a risk to anybody in the UK because a combination of cooking, freezing, inspection of the ports means these diseases have, for practical purposes, died out in this environment. So there are a large number of things you can catch overseas which, whilst a risk to you and a benefit to me professionally, do not actually pose any risk to the general population. Of course, there are things you can do, and there are certain things that people, UK citizens, are probably as liable to do as others in the world. Breathing, eating, drinking, touching, having sex. All of these clearly are ways in which you can transmit infections. Because this is a family lecture, I've illustrated this with shaking hands, although HIV was actually the most recent thing. In shaking hands, incidentally, something you shouldn't do if there's a flu pandemic at any stage. It's an unhygienic habit. But anything which is transmitted these ways, in principle, could be onwardly transmitted in the UK. But there are reasons why, for the majority of diseases, the transmission on, which would have happened in centuries past, is much less likely to happen now. And because I know you're all keen mathematicians, I'm just going to introduce you to one simple concept of epidemiology, which I think helps explain a certain amount, the idea of R0. Essentially, if a disease is passed on average, one person to one person to one person, R0 is 1. That disease is stable in the population. If you have a situation, as you had, for example, towards the end of SARS, where you have 3 people giving it to 2 people giving it to 1 person, that disease is dying out. The R0 is less than 1. And if the R0 is greater than 1, let's say one person gives it to 5, give it to 25, and so on, then that's an R0 of 5, and the disease is increasing in the population. And for your reassurance, I can assure you there are some diseases in the world that have R0s in the hundreds. Malaria in certain parts of Africa, for example. So you can get explosive epidemics, but the reality is that in most diseases that we face in the UK, R0 is either 1, it's roughly stable, or it's been dropping for a very long time. Let's take tuberculosis, for example. In the days of Gin Lane, tuberculosis was a very substantial risk to the UK population. Mortality rates probably over 300 per 100,000 of the general population. And this has gradually decreased over time with a couple of upticks around the world wars. That's to do with socioeconomic and other factors in those stages. The point about this is this TB has decreased because the country has got richer. And that has had an impact on the transmissibility of a whole variety of diseases, of which TB is just a particularly well worked through one. If you look at all the countries in the world, and this is a slide which I've shamelessly taken from Hans Rosling, who does fantastic. Anyone who's interested in presentations should go onto his site, because he does fantastic slides. But this has every country in the world plotted on the GDP per person in US dollars, purchasing power adjusted for those censuses in the city, I think I should make that point, and the life expectancy at birth. And what is extraordinary is the fact, this is a logarithmic scale, but what is extraordinary is the fact they line up so absolutely. So every country in the world is on that graph. Yellow ones are the European countries. We're all clustered up here. The lighter yellow are the Latin Americans. The reds are Asia. The light blues are South Asia. And the dark blues are Africa. As countries get richer, they move up that graph. It follows as an almost inevitability. Medical science can increase or decrease that to some degree, but the biggest thing that will predict the probability. And what is striking is if you look at the early development, the first bit of this, up to around 60, the great majority of that gain is by reduction in infectious diseases, probably 90% of it. That's what happened in the UK. It's what happened subsequently. And if you look, if you compare where we are now, actually I'll just go back if I can. Yeah, if you compare where we are now, this is 45 years old. So the worst countries in the world, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Lesotho, to actually live in terms of life expectancy for slightly different reasons, 45. That's the bottom of the heap. You're doing very badly. If you look back to 1800, the highest country in the world was 40. And others were clustered down there. And as you then move up to 1900, this is the peak of empire. Even here, the richest countries in the world are only nudging 50 as a life expectancy. All of that difference is infectious diseases, and it's essentially due to economic development. And the reasons for this are not single, and I think people often try and say, well, it's due to this and it's due to that. It's not actually. What the reasons for this is a whole series of small incremental steps which add together to make the whole society hardened against infection. The first one, the one that probably got the most early outing, really, was access to water and sanitation. John Snow's famous pump with the handle removed, by improving water supplies, by producing proper sewage disposal, building the embankment, all those sorts of things, a whole series of waterborne diseases, or water-wash diseases in some cases, cholera, typhoid, polio to some degree, and also more trivial but irritating ones like scabies, all go away, just because he provided better sanitation. Better housing and less crowding, extremely important. Crowded people will pass on a whole variety of diseases, typhus, TB, a variety of them. And I've just illustrated this with a nice quotation, which I'll just pause for a minute for people to read, from Cardinal Wiseman. He's writing about the area around Westminster Abbey where these days you would get no change out of £1.5 million for a one-bedroom flat. So that was the situation in central London in 1850. And I think people, when they think about things, people sort of, this is something I'm illustrating largely because of the fact that people don't know why it is that malaria went away in Europe. These, if you looked at these, if I asked you to actually look at those and say, right, where are they? I bet half of you would say they were in Africa and the others would say they were somewhere in Latin America or Asia. These are all in Europe in the 1940s. This is about 3 miles from Rome. That's Spain. These are migratory workers in Italy. This is the Balkans. So the degree of poverty, people, I think, just simply do not remember quite how much genuine poverty there was in Europe as less than a century ago. Then better nutrition. Obviously total nutrition, but also variety of nutrition. I mean, all of you will probably remember what supermarket shelves were like, how the variety of what we have, the amount we have, has changed dramatically even in the last 20 years. So nutrition has improved across the board, and specific deficiencies are very important. So, for example, we now know that vitamin A is essential to our protection against measles. Vitamin D looks as if it's very important for our protection against tuberculosis. So having a balanced diet will actually protect you against a variety of different issues. And if you look at scurvy, now scurvy obviously is not vitamin A, it's vitamin C, but I'm using it as a proxy for nutrition. If you look at scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, and measles mortality in the UK, you see how they almost correlate. That's basically demonstrating the correlation between nutrition and infection. And of course, my own great trade does do its bit to help as well. Just taking vaccines, looking at diphtheria. Diphtheria, one of the great killers of people 200 years ago. If you look back at the early records, diphtheria was a seriously feared disease. Diphtheria incidence has now dropped almost everywhere in the world because of mass vaccination. over and above the sanitation effects. And so if you look at a whole series of infectious diseases, the mortality rates from them have dropped steadily over time, and things like vaccines have tended to help towards the tail end of that to get us right down. And if you take the medical measures like vaccines away, things do bounce back up again as areas which stopped vaccinating children with MMR recently have discovered. So these vaccines do something, but a large proportion of what's there is the whole society is really hardened against infection of any sort. This is a non-specific protection against infection that we have. It doesn't matter what the infection is. Basically, all infections we are much less likely to get than previous generations. And then better cure. This is a Lowry. Those of you who went to the recent outstanding Lowry exhibition, you'll have seen this painting. This is the fever van. This is a living memory of several people in this audience. The fever van would arrive, the medical officer of health would take a child away to hospital forcibly, all of their belongings would be burnt, everything would be, all the wallpaper would be stripped, they would have their entire room covered in carbolic acid, the child would be taken to hospital, there's a high chance that child would die. That was the pre-antibiotic era. Those are simple bacterial skin infections in the main. Antibiotic era, so antibiotics have made it very unlikely you will die. They also have reduced the risk, again, of onward transmission of bacterial diseases. And finally, the herd effect. When you go to your nice last night of the proms and lustily are singing Land of Hope and Glory, you will be very relieved to know that all the people around you are well. The fact is that anything that is good for my neighbour is, from an infectious disease point of view, good also for me. And so the fact that everybody has got better nutrition, better housing, and all these things means that you, as an individual, you as a family unit, are much protected every time you go out in public. So this combination of different factors coming together has made you a much less susceptible to virtually any infection that nature can throw at us than previous generations were. And I think that is the sort of the counter side to the fact that increasing transport and other factors clearly do bring new risks. And what that's meant is that infectious diseases here in the UK are now something people basically die only at the extremes of life. And in fact, in reality, almost all the deaths, this is the last Chief Medical Officer's report for the UK, for England and Wales, not the UK as a whole, but Scotland, I can assure you, is very similar. Almost all the deaths are in people over the age of 80. That would not have been the case even 3 decades ago. So that's an astonishing turnaround due to socioeconomic development in a variety of different ways. And then there will be some down here in the neonatal under 1 year era, but actually those numbers are basically trivial compared to the elderly. So the problem of infections in the elderly is a very serious problem, but those infections are ones that all of you currently have on you or in you at this moment in time. That is what will kill you if something else doesn't get to you first. It's something you've currently got now, no foreigners involved. This is 100% homegrown, good old-fashioned British bacteria. Yes. And of course, we've also done overseas some deliberate actions to eradicate diseases. We've only so far achieved one, smallpox, an astonishing achievement against very difficult odds. We are very shortly about to do another one, a rather unpleasant infection called guinea worm. The last few cases are still wandering around somewhere in Africa, but I would anticipate that within 5 years that will be gone. The currently most challenging and challenged thing is polio. Polio, a terrible disease of paralysis. Again, many of you may well know people from your childhood who'd had polio, now unknown in our society. Polio is now down to 3 endemic countries, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And there's an outbreak which last started 2 or 3 months ago and is now quite serious in East Africa, imported from Nigeria. The polio map has looked pretty stable for several years now. We're almost there in terms of polio eradication, but not quite. And I think, and maybe this is a subject for another talk on another day, the issues about how you get to the final stages of eradication are difficult and are often as much about politics and belief as they are about medicine. And then one of the great attempts at eradication, malaria. Disease I've worked on for many years. This is malaria in 1948, just after the war. And the thing I want you to look at is the fact that malaria at that stage was right up in California. Large areas of the southern USA were malarial swamps. and it was a substantial problem in southern Europe and in northern Australia. And the eradication effort that occurred in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s is considered now to be a failure. But it wasn't really a failure. What it did is it pushed malaria right down into its heartlands. But of course, it didn't get rid of it completely, demonstrating how difficult it is actually to get rid of diseases absolutely completely whilst countries are still poor. That's what I want to stress. Whilst a country is poor, getting rid of a disease is a real challenge. Once countries become richer, it becomes a great deal easier. And this is despite very extraordinary efforts by the world to eradicate that disease. This is you've got to remember, this is the post-war era. People believed in top-down, heavily militarized, very well-organized, you and you do it this way. And keep on doing it till I tell you to stop, or you have to peel potatoes the rest of the week. That was the way it was done. It was very effective, but it didn't. In poor countries, they hit a brick wall. Poverty is our biggest barrier to trying to get rid of diseases from the world. Now, moving on to the UK, where are our risks going to come from? Well, I think the first thing people often look at or ask about is, how about the migrant communities? People who have come first or second generation migrants, they've come to the UK with some infectious diseases maybe, or they're going back, they have links to people in infectious diseases. Well, the first thing to say about this is the migrant communities in the UK are very heavily concentrated. This map here is a density map of all people of African descent living in the UK. They all live in London. This is people of South Asian descent, and they sort of live in a belt. Basically, it's the the big Midland cities and London in the southeast to a greater extent. Very large areas of the country have no migrant population we're speaking of at all. So you might say, well, maybe we should be concentrating our risks on the areas where migrants are. However, that is to misunderstand the issues. The great majority of infections which can cause problems, someone will be non-infectious for practical purposes within 21 days of touching down in the UK. So this migrant family is of no greater risk than anyone else in the general population. The exceptions to that are HIV, hepatitis B, both of which you can only catch really by trying, i.e. by sleeping with people, or sharing needles, and some years later by TB, but remember, most people in the UK are not going to get TB because they are wealthy, healthy, well-nourished. Essentially, they are hardened against it. So the risks from migrants of infections are substantially exaggerated. How about our furry friends? Most new and emerging infections come in some way from animals, and I'm just pointing out a few of them. I'm going to start off with this friend, our closest relative, chimpanzee. The chimp is what gave us HIV-1. So it's a monkey disease. These fruit bats, generally pretty friendly guys, give us Ebola from time to time. BSE, all of you will probably remember. Mexican swine flu. And the most recent thing, and I have to say this is to me a slightly greater worry than to some others, novel coronavirus, Middle Eastern novel coronavirus, first cases were reported only a year ago now. It kills 45% of the people who get it. Doesn't appear to currently be very transmissible. There's a reservoir in camels. It probably came originally from bats. There's a big outbreak of it in Saudi Arabia. And the reason I stress that is the Hajj is about to start in Saudi Arabia. So people from across the entire Muslim world are about to come together in an incredibly crammed environment. If this chooses to become a lot more transmissible at this point in time, it'll spread throughout the entire Islamic world within 3 weeks. So just think about that. So these kinds of threats are non-trivial. You need to keep an eye on them, and they almost all come from animals. Now, in reality, in the UK, almost all the animals that people come into close contact with are either domestic pets or a very restricted range of animals. And the main one that I would focus on for current risks is poultry. And that's because of avian influenza, H5N1. The thing about avian influenza is it is not very transmissible currently, but it is highly virulent. Transmissible means its ability to transmit from person to person. Virulence is to do with its ability to kill people. Most people who get, a large proportion of people who get H5N1 from avian sources have a very severe illness, and quite a high proportion of them die. But at this point in time, it looks as if you need to pretty well conduct mouth-to-beak resuscitation of a dying bird actually to catch it. But at some point what will happen, what has happened with all previous influenzas, and this is true for many other animals, is at a certain point they become more transmissible. Some genetic mutations occur and the transmissibility across species happens. In the UK, it's likely to be, if we get something from an animal rather than a human importing it, it's likely to be one of the farm animals. And here's the map of density of the various farm animals in the UK. This one here is poultry. The darker red it is, the more there are. This one here is pigs. There's pig farming in the UK. And this one here is cattle. So if we actually were to get a zoonosis, you can pretty well predict from the UK, you can pretty well predict where it's going to be from based on these. And it's not, interestingly, the same places as the migrants are. In fact, they're almost the opposite, if you look at it. And this, just by way of contrast, is the global poultry density. And really, many of the human-animal interactions with poultry are right here in China and Southeast Asia. So the probabilities if we get a poultry-related infection that isn't homegrown, which is statistically the most likely, this is the area we should be looking to. But, and here again, things are moving steadily in the right direction from an infectious point of view. There is a gradual reduction in human-animal contact. Partly, this is because of changes in farming. These are both farming methods in Kenya. This is a Kenyan thing. You might think it's in the UK. This is actually just next to Mount Kenya. As we move from this kind of farming to this kind of farming, the number of humans exposed to animals substantially reduces, and their risks substantially reduce. And because people are moving away from day-to-day hunting and other activities, the number of different species we come into contact with is dramatically decreasing. And urbanization, one of the biggest drivers of demographic features of the current era, this last year was the point where, for the first time in history, the majority of humans were urban. Urbanization takes us even further away from a situation where human-animal contact happens. So essentially, fewer humans are having animal contact because of development. We're having fewer contacts with different sorts of animals, and the majority of the urban population will never see an animal except in a zoo or unless they have a pet hamster. So, and I'm not aware of any hamster-related diseases that you should be worried about at this point in time. You'll be sad to hear. So, so when it comes to new infections, we undoubtedly will have more new infections from time to time, but they are a relatively low risk. Now, I'm going to move on to something where there really is a risk, and this is antimicrobial resistance. Our current Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davis, has made a big push in the last year about the major threat that our antimicrobial resistance forces on us at the moment. There are big antibiotic resistance to bacteria. I think most people are aware of these. There's significant now multi-drug resistant, or even what's called XDR, extended multi-drug resistance to tuberculosis. There is significant drug resistance to some of our HIV drugs. Influenza seems to be able to develop drug resistance to our current drugs incredibly quickly, and antiparasitic drugs like malaria, antimalarial drug resistance is spreading as well from Southeast Asia. So the risks of importing not a new infection, but a drug-resistant infection are, I think, now should be seen as significant. And a lot of this is driven by poor medical and vet practice, weak regulation, low adherence by people who are given drugs, not generally by poverty in itself. So these can come from almost anywhere in the world, whereas the zoonotic diseases are likely to come from poor places where human-animal contact is much more common. These can come from virtually anywhere. And let us just illustrate that with TB. The really big hotspots for multi-drug resistant TB, there is multi-drug resistant TB around the world, and extended drug resistant, particularly in South Africa. But the really big hotspots for that, in fact, are in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. But they could be almost anywhere. This is just a tradition has grown up of a particular approach to TB drugs that led to drug resistance emerging. So the importation of ordinary infections which are drug resistant, so if you're unlikely to get them because you're in a society which is well nourished, healthy, well housed, but if you do get them, the chances of actually being able to cure them is actually currently probably decreasing because of this problem of drug resistance. Some of it homegrown, some of it imported. Although it is important, I think, not to see this as predominantly a problem of imported infection. I rather like this Daily Mail headline. Daily Mail are very good on headlines about infections from foreigners, although the article beneath it was remarkably accurate. And I particularly like this map, which is how these huge arrows of Britain being invaded. It's rather like Dad's Army, the thing at the beginning where the arrows come in and everything looks dreadful. Actually, when it comes to, this was for Clostridium difficile, when it comes to the hospital-acquired infections, MRSA, Clostridium difficile, and those sorts of things, what we found is the key thing is old-fashioned hygiene. If you wash your hands, the diseases go away. So the problem is not nasty foreigners importing it, it's nice Brits not washing their hands enough. And it is important that we do actually concentrate on the cause. And this was MRSA about 7 or 8 years ago. At that point, probably the UK was in Europe a net exporter of MRSA, if anything. Since then, we've really got on top of the problem, and that's been due to very old-fashioned hygiene measures which would have been recognisable by our great-grandparents. Basically, wash your hands with soap is what it took. Finally, thinking about the wider abroad, statistically, the probability of a new infection emerging, a new drug resistance emerging, is sort of even depending on the number of people there are. And at the point when many of us were born, the number, for example, of people in Europe was over twice the number of people in Africa. Looking to the end of this century, over a third of the world's population will be African, around just under a half will be Asian or Latin American. Europe is virtually nowhere. The big risks, statistically, are from the places with the big populations. I'm not talking about poverty, I'm just talking about numbers. And these are the places we should look to. And for that reason, the big impact we can do to protect ourselves, and the thing which actually will make it extremely unlikely that we in due course do get invaded, or at least reduce the risk of getting invaded, is development of those countries. If the same sorts of things which have hardened our country against infection occur in other countries, their infectious disease risk will go down, and their risk to us will go down. At a country level, just as at an individual level, what's good for me is what's good for my neighbour. And in this, I have to say, the UK has an extremely proud tradition, including, I have to say, our chairman, who's a major contribution on this. Maybe not quite to the same extent as these three on the left, but certainly many of the people on the right. Florence Nightingale's work in India, extraordinary. She never actually left the UK for this, but she had a real impact on sanitation in the UK. Sir Ronald Ross, second Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering the life cycle of malaria. This is brucellosis and sleeping sickness, but also many modern people. Sir Brian Greenwood from my own college, Dame Janet Hemingway from the Liverpool School, Professor Nick White from Oxford. These are people who are really improving the health of countries elsewhere. The only reason for doing that is to reduce death and disease in those countries. But it also has the effect, which is good, as a secondary gain, unintended but important secondary gain, that it improves things for us as well. And this is working. I think the continent which most people think of as not developing at all is Africa. That's a very old-fashioned view. I rather like this headline from The Economist from last year, and it is in fact true. Africa is experiencing some of the biggest falls in child mortality ever seen anywhere. So many countries in Africa, they are reducing their rate of under 5 mortality at between 5 and 10% a year. That's astonishing when you think about it. And that improvement is virtually all mediated by infectious diseases. So the infectious disease risk is decreasing even in the poorest countries in the world due to a combination of general development and good medical science. This will, of course, not stop the emergence of new diseases. New diseases will emerge. New diseases have emerged in all of our lifetimes. HIV, SARS, BSE, CJD, a whole variety of things have emerged, and some of them will be serious over time. But it substantially reduces the risk of old diseases spreading, and actually the non-specific effect of economic development in our own country hardens us as a country against virtually anything that is thrown against us. So this lecture really has, I hope, pointed, and was intended to point, a broadly optimistic picture, but with some caveats. Infections have always been imported, and some of them have been devastating. And some of the recent infections which have been imported to countries other than our own, such as HIV, have certainly been devastating in our own lifetime. Travel is increasing. However, the combinations of all the things that go with a richer society, better water, sanitation, housing, nutrition, heating, a whole variety of things, no one of them solves the problem, but incrementally, the impact of this on the risk of anyone in our society getting an infection is substantially reduced. And they are much lower than historically. It is much better to be a poor person in a rich country from an infectious point of view than to be a rich person in a poor country. If you think about the number of kings and emperors who died of infectious diseases in Europe, despite having more food and drink than they knew what to do with, you'll realise that you basically want to be surrounded by pretty wealthy people. That's good. And I don't mean socially, I mean purely infectious point of view. Preventative and curative medicine have reduced the risk further. Many of the imported infections which are most graphic and which people are concerned about most cannot be transmitted in our society. And most new infections, new to the world that is, are from animals, both here and overseas. And statistically, they're likely to be overseas because that's where most people who have interaction with animals are. The spread of antimicrobial drug resistance is a very serious risk. And I think that is something we do need to do something about with a considerable degree of urgency. And my repeated message really on this, what is good for my neighbour is good for me. Increasing prosperity and health worldwide is the surest way of making sure that we do not get infections here in the UK. Thank you very much.